Why is America, the richest and most powerful country in the world, in danger of defaulting on its debts? Joining me in this episode is Ben Ritz, the director of PPI's Center for Funding America's Future and all-around budget guru. We discuss the federal budget and the debt ceiling crisis, how the debt ceiling crisis came about, why exactly it is dangerous, why the parties are so far apart on the politics of this, and how it might be resolved. It's a fascinating discussion with a bunch of history, political analysis, and I think you'll really enjoy it. If you do enjoy the podcast, please like, rate, subscribe, all of those good things. And if you really love the podcast, you can support us at patreon.com/Neoliberal Podcast. You can also support us by becoming a member of the Center for New Liberalism. Members get access to bonus episodes, our community Slack, filled with insiders, and much more. You can become a member by going to cnliberalism.org/become a member. Thanks for listening and enjoy the episode. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Neoliberal Podcast, part of the Center for New Liberalism. I'm your host, Jeremiah Johnson, and joining me today is Ben Ritz. Ben, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So I think the first question we've got to address, just to kind of set where we are, is what is the debt ceiling? What is the debt limit that people are talking about? Where did this come from? And why do we even have this kind of periodic thing where we all panic every 2 years or so about, is the country going to run out of debt ceiling? What does that mean? Why are we even in this spot historically?
Yeah, so originally when Congress would appropriate more money, it would want to spend more money than it raised in tax revenue, it would also vote to issue bonds to cover the difference between revenues and spending to make up the difference. And in the early half of the 20th century, they decided that rather than doing a vote on every single bond issuance, they were going to delegate to Treasury, up to this amount, you can issue bonds to cover the needs of the country. And so the debt limit was actually a way to streamline borrowing to cover the difference between revenues and spending. But that still required this vote every so often of raising that limit. The limit is it's different than limiting the actual difference between revenues and spending. The policies that lead to the accumulation of debt and the needs to run debt are different from the debt limit, which really just governs how you finance that difference.
Do you know if any other countries have this problem, or a similar setup, or is this kind of a weird American thing that everybody looks at us and says, that's strange?
There are one or two other countries that have it, but for the most part, it's just weird.
It's just weird. Okay, so we used to just issue bonds via congressional vote, and now instead we just have a limit. And every so often we run up into that limit, and we have to raise the limit because the debt has historically, in the last 50 or 60 years, only been going up and up and up, with some small exceptions, right?
Right.
So we've had this kind of crisis a couple times. When did it start actually becoming a crisis? Because for a while, nobody knew this really existed. This was a feature of government, but it wasn't important. When did this start to become a thing that people fought about?
So I think it's always historically, there have always been conflicts around the debt limit. I mean, even going back to Eisenhower, we were having the one party try to extract concessions from the other. I remember that there was something about the Korean War during one debt limit increase. This has historically been a point of negotiating leverage for the side that doesn't feel like it has it.
Really? Because I think of this as a very modern problem, but you're saying it's always been a little bit of game of I'm going to extract something from you because of this.
It's been a game, but I don't think it's been a crisis level game until 2011 was really when it started, because you had this game, but both sides understood they weren't. It was sort of an excuse to do something they kind of had to do anyway.
And Congress just functioned better back in those days.
Right,
yeah.
right. And so 2011 was really when it became a crisis where you had one side say, well, if you don't give us what we want, we might not actually agree to raise the debt limit. It went from we're going to vote to raise the debt limit anyway, and what's a sweetener we can get along the way, to give us something or else. We came closer to default in 2011 than we ever have in history, with one sort of small technical exception in the 70s. But closer to a true default that happened in 2011. We had one side genuinely seem like they might not be willing to raise the limit, and sort of since then, when we got our credit downgraded and all of the financial implications that came from it, I would say the debt limit has taken on a different, more serious threat than it was for most of its history.
And why is it such a serious thing? I mean, you and I are familiar with this conversation, but every listener, there probably are some listeners who are well aware of what would happen if we defaulted on our debt. But if the U.S. actually hits this limit and it doesn't get raised, why would that actually be really catastrophic? What's the logic behind that?
So it's because of the role that the government plays in our financial system and the interconnectedness of it all. So the Treasury Department needs to be able to make interest payments on outstanding bonds. Other financial institutions hold treasuries sort of as the foundational product. Treasuries are the safest asset, and everything else is marked up relative to that. If you're no longer sure that you're going to get paid interest on your treasury bond, number one, you're going to demand more interest for those bonds. And so as interest rates on treasuries go up, interest rates on everything that is less safe than treasuries, which is everything, is also going to go up. On top of that, if a business or an individual was planning on using that interest payment to make another payment, and they no longer have that income, which was supposed to be very reliable, now that's a payment they can't make. And whoever was supposed to get that payment can't make their next payment. And so because the debt is trillions and trillions of dollars, that is an immediate loss of liquidity to the system.
And if the government runs into this issue where, say, okay, we can't have any more debt, we've hit the debt limit and we have not raised it, and so we're not going to be able to pay our bills. Now, the government's bills are a lot of things. They pay military contractors, they pay government employees' salaries, and that's everything from members of Congress to members of the military to just civil servants. They pay out Social Security checks and Medicare checks and welfare, and then they pay treasuries. Would they have any ability to actually control what gets paid and what doesn't? Or is it kind of like, we don't even know, like it might just be a chaotic default and who knows what would end up getting paid?
Yeah, the short answer to that is no, they don't. I mean, you got to remember during the pandemic, think about like unemployment insurance and how difficult it was to get some of those systems to do something they weren't originally designed to do. Now you're talking about...
You're saying the government is inflexible, Ben?
Yeah, and it's not just... And, with unemployment insurance, it was one program spread across all the different states. But now you're talking about, not just unemployment, but Medicare, and not just Medicare, but Social Security, and all the different agencies and all the different programs that those agencies run. And
let's not understate the complexity of the federal government. Like when people say run the government like a company, I always laugh, because what company does the tens of thousands of different things that the federal government does? It's the complexity of how many different programs there are out there is mind-boggling.
Yeah. So like how you pick and choose, Treasury's not equipped to do that. I mean, you have the closest thing you have to this is you have proposals by Republicans to you pass the bill that would say in the event of a default, you prioritize these payments. Even if you were to pass that bill, it would take months or years to figure out how to implement it. You can't just do that when the systems aren't designed to do it. Could they just universally stop paying? So some of the questions are like, if we did a default, what happens? One of the kind of more common theories out there is the federal government would not pay its bills the first day after the X date or the second day until it had enough money to cover a full day's worth of payments. And then it would make that payment, and then it would do the same thing. And so you would have sort of all payments be delayed until each day's payments could be made. That's like the closest you could probably get. But in terms of picking and choosing programs, I don't see how they would do that.
One interesting note that I just want to note before we move on, you made a really good point that, this would be really expensive for the US in the long term, beyond just being catastrophic that, we are defaulting on our debt. We might not pay back some treasury people. It might be chaotic. Which programs don't receive funding anymore? There's a weird thing that's happening with treasury rates. And obviously you make the point, if there's additional risk for treasuries, then people are going to demand more interest payments to take those treasuries. But also people are getting really scared about the environment, and panic in the market means that typically people flock to safe assets.
Which are treasuries.
I think treasuries have actually gone down a little bit in terms of people are flocking because it's this weird, we really almost don't know what would happen because the entire system is built around the idea that the US, in all practical terms, in its 200 years plus of history, has never really defaulted on its debt. The US debt is perfect, good asset. And if that is no longer the case, we don't know what happens after that.
So part of it is, I think we see it vary based on what specific treasury instrument we are talking about. So bonds that are supposed to mature in the range where we might be in default, they command higher premiums, especially some of the shorter term instruments. Those rates do go up. But yeah, if we default on our debt for a month, let's say, that's not really going to have a major impact on the federal government's ability to pay out a bond that's going to mature in 5 years. It will have some marginal impact because, our borrowing costs will go up permanently. But in terms of, is this bond going to get repaid, 5 years out, unless the U.S. government disappears or truly melts down, of course it's going to get paid at some point. And if you got to the point where it wouldn't, then you'd have obviously more significant implications. So it makes sense that other treasury instruments that aren't in this range of likely being defaulted on would go down as you sort of get that fear response.
That's a good point. I just actually pulled it up on my computer, and yeah, the 1 month bonds are current over the last week. I'm just looking at 1 week of data because the crisis is going to happen very soon. 1 week is a long time right now. What the 1 month bonds over the last week have moved in the opposite direction as the 5-year bonds and the 10-year bonds.
And that makes perfect sense. That's exactly what you would expect from rational market hypothesis.
All right, so let's talk about the politics of this. Now that we kind of understand the technical aspect, why is this happening? How did we get here? What might the implications be? Which we still are kind of guessing because it would be such a catastrophic event. A lot of bad things would happen, and it's hard to describe exactly how the dominoes would fall. We can probably describe the first couple dominoes. The dominoes after that, it's a guess. But let's talk about the politics of it. Why do we see such a strong response from Republicans? Because at least my typical view on this, I am a partisan Democrat. You also work for PPI. We are Democrats. This is who we are. But the way I see it, even taking into account that I have my own bias, is that Republicans are the ones who are causing the risk here. Democrats never threatened to blow up, or at least never credibly threatened to blow up the debt ceiling. It's always, whenever there's a Democratic president and Republicans in Congress are unhappy, they threaten to blow up the debt ceiling. Is it any more complicated than that, or is it basically just Republicans are being irresponsible?
I think it partially speaks to the political dynamics in the Republican Party. I think, it's very difficult to imagine somebody who gets a successful Democratic primary challenger because they voted to raise the debt limit. That's just not a thing that happens. Even among Republicans who understand the debt limit, there is this concern that you're going to get primaried by somebody further right who doesn't understand the debt limit and is going to say, you voted to raise the debt limit by $2 trillion. So you added $2 trillion to the debt, or they'll say you suspended it for 2 years. You said that we can run up unlimited debt for 2 years. I think it's kind of the fear of the Republican primary that is why we get it on the Republican side. And I think one interesting dynamic that separates now from 2011 is I think in 2011 you saw a lot more Republicans who felt a sincere compulsion to try to put a governor on debt and to get the budget situation under control by any means necessary. And I think now this class is a lot more focused on getting a win and kind of fighting where they can, and they don't actually want to have a fight over the debt limit. They just don't want to get attacked for not having a fight over the debt limit. So they're sort of having a fight that they feel like they have to because of their internal party pressure, rather than thinking that they actually want to do this.
Is this like the political equivalent of like, hold me back, bro? Kind of like, you know, I'm definitely going to fight this guy if you don't hold me back. But what you're secretly hoping is that like 3 of your friends do hold you back. Because you don't actually want to fight. You just want to really seem like you didn't chicken out.
I think there's a lot. I mean, yeah, the debt limit vote is one of the quintessential vote no, hope yes votes for a lot of Republicans.
Yeah. Just another reason why our primary system sucks in America. And we need to, I don't know how we do it, but it would be great if we could figure out some way to fix that. So you mentioned 2011 there, and that's what I think of as kind of the genesis of like modern debt ceiling crisis. Although it's news to me that apparently we've been having smaller versions of this way back.
So you want to hear? So here's a fun fact that I think people don't think about very often.
Hit me.
President Obama actually did debt limit concessions when Democrats had control of Congress. They just looked very different. So the Bowles-Simpson Fiscal Commission.
And see, this is what I was going to ask you about: is how did 2011 end up resolving?
Well, no. So I'm not talking about 2011. I'm talking about This is 2010.
Oh, really?
In 2010, he had to raise the debt limit, and to get Blue Dogs to vote for raising the debt limit, he pledged to establish the Bowles-Simpson Fiscal Commission that kind of set the deficit debate for the remainder of his presidency. So you know, we've been, even again, this is when Democrats had full control of Congress and a filibuster-proof supermajority. So again, we did have sort of superficial negotiations. It's just, you know, 2011 was when they took on no, I'm actually going to do it this time character.
So that is a fun fact that Obama was even giving concessions back then. But how did the 2011 episode end up resolving? Because that was the first like big time that somebody said, we might actually just vote no. We might actually just crash the ship if we don't get what we want.
So it resolved through two things. It was there was an agreement that they would, in addition to voting to raise the debt limit, they would give President Obama the ability to raise the debt limit additional times, subject to a vote of disapproval from Congress. And then if they voted to disapprove, Obama could just veto it. So it was pretty clearly they were giving up their authority. And they paired that with some pretty deep spending cuts.
That's a great mechanism, by the way, because it's one of those, you called it vote no, hope yes. It lets them vote no in a totally toothless manner, basically.
Yeah, exactly. And then now many Democrats didn't take advantage of that, because by that point we'd all established that the debt limit was crazy, and so they didn't actually have a political benefit for voting against raising the debt limit anymore. But the second important component of the Budget Control Act, which was the bill that did this, were pretty tight caps on discretionary spending, the percentage of the budget that is appropriated annually by Congress. And the way that those cuts materialized was actually not what was intended. Originally, there were caps on discretionary spending, which were actually, I think, pretty reasonable given all the circumstances. And there was a mechanism that was supposed to force Congress to come up with additional spending cuts on the mandatory side of the budget. That's the automatic spending programs, and through additional revenues. And there was a fail-safe mechanism called sequestration that would further cut discretionary spending if a deal couldn't be reached. And then it couldn't be reached, and then we had those sequester cuts.
I think this is one of those things that is like a secret password for, are you a political nerd or not? You know, for people everyone in DC is a political nerd, but for people in the rest of the country, if you say like the sequester, does that mean anything to you? Most people are going to say no, but if they're a political nerd, they're going to say, "Oh, I remember when sequestration was a whole thing."
Also, might be a function of age.
Yeah. So I'm going to throw a couple statements at you, and I just want you to have a hot take at them.
Okay.
Agree, disagree, need to explain it. The first is that obviously it is an insane idea to hold that debt limit hostage. Ideally, the debt limit would not even exist, and we would have spending debates independent of that. That's idea number one. Idea number two is that in 2011, it was a bad idea for them to do austerity, and Obama should not have folded. But, you know, in the end, he did, whatever.
Wait, are these statements related, or can I respond to each individually?
I'm going to give you, all at once. Let me get through all three.
All right, it's good. Okay.
Okay. So the debt limit is, bad, just as a concept. Number two is that Obama should not have, we probably needed a little bit more stimulus where the economy was depressed back then. We had such a slow climb out of the Great Recession. And so the sharp kind of version of austerity or sequester that we had ended up being bad. That's idea number two. Idea number three is that right now, spending cuts or tax increases or however you want to lower the deficit is actually quite a good idea because the economy is overheated at this point. The unemployment is as low as it's ever been practically. Inflation is very high. And the Fed can do what it can with monetary policy, but it would be really nice if fiscal policy also contributed to kind of cooling down inflation. So I just react to that in general because it's how I see the world. And I'm curious, you live in budget world. How do you react to the idea that the debt ceiling is bad, but 2011 we made a mistake to do austerity, but this time it might actually be a good idea to do some austerity?
I think I agree with all of those statements. I have mixed feelings about the Obama era, the first round of budget control act caps before sequester took effect, because they actually they weren't too tight initially. They were, I don't want to say they were backloaded, but they were there was some room at the beginning. And so clearly the amount of cuts we did back then was problematic, how much we ended up doing with the sequester. And certainly there is no argument that we are it makes sense to cut discretionary spending now and it didn't then, because at that time our issue was the long-term budget trajectory. And the whole point of the Budget Control Act and sequester was to force a grappling with the long-term budget trajectory, not these short-term discretionary spending issues. Now, I mean, we still have the long-term budget issue, but there's actually a good argument for getting discretionary spending down, because you have discretionary spending go up during a crisis and down during a time like this. And so I think it does make sense.
That's just classic Keynesian economics.
Right.
A lot of time Keynesian economics is kind of parodied as you spend money to make money, infinite money. But no, it just says during the downturn you should spend money, and ideally the opposite in boom times.
Right, exactly. I mean, there's no economic rationale for increasing discretionary spending faster than GDP growth right now. Now, that said, I don't think that's really anything anybody's proposing. So I think that's fine.
Yeah, it's been interesting to see kind of which commentators get stuck in our politics for the last 10 years has been more spending is good, and I'm just unable to get out of that, as opposed to people who I actually respect if they make this turn and says, well, I wanted a lot more money back then, but right now I acknowledge that it's not the time.
And I think you could look back at 2011 and say the same thing. There were a lot of folks who came out of the Clinton balanced budget years and said, we have the Bush tax cut deficits. People forget that in 2007, Democrats were putting out plans to still balance the budget. It was really only after the financial crisis where, we're like, this doesn't make sense anymore. And that was an appropriate pivot, but it took a while to get out of we have to get back to a balanced budget mindset after 2008. And now it is taking a while to get out of the more money good mindset.
Yeah, I'll say that it's difficult for me to kind of ever say Republicans have done something right, but I think the Republican instinct, or just the fiscally conservative instinct, if we don't want to say Republicans specifically, the instinct that says, well, it's time to work on the deficit. We should get spending down. We should just reduce the deficit. Debt is a long-term problem. We should at least start to address that. I think that's correct. Obviously, it is an insane idea to use that with kind of this leverage of if we don't get what we want, we're going to crash the country, or, the Republican plan being tax increases are unacceptable. So we're basically just going to cut.
Sort of. I mean, so the tax increase, are we going to get to, get to that?
I mean, in general, I will say the overall Republican approach is just generously 90 to 95% spending slashing and very little appetite for tax increases. They have actually technically proposed a couple tax increases, right? Because they're more like getting rid of some loopholes, which is... Yeah.
So I think this is an important point that hasn't gotten enough coverage. But I mean, the Republican debt limit proposal, the McCarthy bill, 100% breaks the Grover Norquist no new taxes pledge. The pledge is very straightforward, and this is what he loves about it. But they've gotten tripped up here, and it says you're not going to increase rates, and if you get higher revenues from getting rid of tax deductions and credits, you have to apply that revenue to a rate cut to offset it. And if you do a net revenue increase from getting rid of credits and deductions, that's a pledge violation. And the McCarthy debt limit bill does exactly that. So I mean, it is an interesting crack in that no new taxes pledge.
And I mean, a lot of this for our listeners who love getting into wonky tax policy, this is your shit right now. But a lot of this is very like technicality focused. Like if you want to do say a welfare program for middle class people, and you just send them all checks, right? The government pays for a program and you send them all $1,000 check every month. That gets counted as government spending. We tax someone, we gave you the check, now it's your money now. But if instead you just say, well, you're a middle class homeowner, and instead of giving you $1,000 check, we're going to lower your taxes that you pay on your house or whatever. We're going to give you a tax exemption. It's the same effect. It's practically the same thing, but it gets counted as lowering taxes rather than spending the money on them. And you call this, there's a technical term like tax expenditures. And so there's always this debate of like, is a tax expenditure government spending or not? Like, yeah.
And that's sort of where Republicans like to call it spending when they don't like the policy, and call it revenue when they do, and call it a tax cut when they do. But the thing about the Grover Norquist pledge is it does not have any of that ambiguity. It is pretty clear. Yes, you can count it as, spending from the, you can say you're reducing the rate and you're making the tax code cleaner, but if you get rid of a tax expenditure and you don't do an offsetting rate cut, that is a tax increase according to the pledge.
All right, so the political situation we're in right now is that Republicans want to negotiate, basically. They have finally passed a bill through the House, and it took them a lot of wringing their hands and figuring out what they could actually do. But they've passed a bill through the House that says we will raise the debt limit if you do the following things. We want these budgetary concessions.
I mean, it's a lot more than just budgetary concessions. They want a lot of things.
It's a lot of stuff. But to my mind, it looks pretty extreme. That is because I am a partisan Democrat. But I also think that they just went extreme because they don't think it's going to happen. They kind of put in their wish list, and their real goal is to just negotiate. They want a negotiation where they can get something.
They feel like they have to have the fight.
And so the Democrats and President Joe Biden, up to this point, have said, we do not want to negotiate. The right thing to do, the principled thing to do, is to just raise the debt ceiling. And then if you want to talk about the budget, let's talk about the budget afterwards. And neither side seems to be backing down. A lot of people are actually very worried that there's a real chance we could default. I guess two questions here. Number one, how real is the chance we could default? And how do we get out of the mess that, if both sides are like committed to not backing down?
So the first question, how likely we are to default, I think is probably actually not the right question anymore. President Biden came out in the last 24 hours and said he thinks that the 14th Amendment option means that he keeps paying debt, even if the debt ceiling isn't raised. And I think there's a strong legal argument.
And can we explain what that is?
Sure.
For somebody who's not following this as obsessively as we are.
Yeah, sure. So the 14th Amendment says the validity of the public debt of the United States authorized by law shall not be questioned. So the idea here is that if the federal government doesn't raise the debt limit, then it's not paying its debts, and that's in violation of the 14th Amendment. On top of that,
it would be just unconstitutional for us to not pay our debts.
Right. On top of that, there's also a legal argument that Congress has passed conflicting laws. They have said you can only borrow this much, and you have to raise only this much tax revenue, and you have to do all of this spending. And those are contradictory.
And that's a good point that I think people understand inside DC, but even inside DC, it's not emphasized enough. I know Democrats love to say this, but Congress has passed a bunch of laws that say you have to spend all this money, and then a separate law that says, well, the debt can only go up to this. But they've passed a law that, practically speaking, would take us past the debt limit. That's why they're not doing it just because they love debt.
Right. So you have this situation where the Constitution says you have to pay the debt. You have one law that says you have to run up the debt and borrow, and another that says you can't. The president has to, if he's going to break the law in some form or another, because the laws are contradictory, you're going to go with the interpretation that, number one, doesn't destroy the global economy, and number two, is more consistent with your reading of the Constitution. So I think that the odds of an actual default are pretty low. That said, if we don't raise the debt limit, then we have this question of, do the Republicans take President Biden to court, and what's a court going to do? And if every bond that is issued after we hit the X date is subject to being overturned by the court, then we might have the same financial ramifications. And so even though I think the question is, do we default? It's really what matters is, do we raise the debt limit in time for the X date? Now, to your other question, I think that is kind of what has to happen is there has to be an agreement where the Republicans can say, we got something, and Democrats can say, we negotiated on a different thing. It just happened to be at the same time as the debt limit.
Yeah, this is what I saw from a reporter named Jeff Stein, who said that the way out that it looks likely is that, there's a negotiation that Republicans say is part and Democrats insist is like another, which seems very flimsy to me, especially on the part of the Democrats. It's not really part of the thing when clearly it is.
Well, before that article, we were arguing last month. I had a piece out when the problem solvers put out a framework to this effect of, let's do a short-term debt ceiling increase that gets us past the budget deadline. Then let's do a budget deal consistent with the budget deadline. And once we have a budget deal, we will pass a debt ceiling increase that covers all the borrowing we need to pay for the budget deal that we just struck. And I think you could make the argument, I did make the argument, that in that situation, Republicans would get their negotiations and Democrats could say, we negotiated as part of the budget process, not the debt limit. Now, it seems like since a short-term increase has been ruled out by McCarthy, we're just maybe going to do that on an expedited timeline. Democrats will say, we've agreed to a spending caps deal that just happened to happen 2 weeks before the X date. We did not negotiate over the debt limit. And, Republicans will say what they're going to say. But I think that really is the path out of here, because like I said, Republicans feel like they need to have the fight, and Democrats, need to not reward the hostage taking. And so whatever allows them both to do those things, I think that's the path out of there.
I also wonder about how united the caucuses are. One thing that struck me earlier was when you talked about 2010, even with full Democratic control of Congress, Obama had to give up a little something because there were blue dog Democrats, kind of conservative Democrats, who had values that wanted to see this done, that wanted spending reductions. And so I think about the current situation, and I wonder, are there Democrats who are conservative enough or fiscally moderate or whatever you would want to call it, who would kind of side with the Republicans and say, this is the time to do some fiscal moderation, some spending cuts, even if they might not love everything the Republicans are doing, they say, okay, well, we should think about something, though. We should negotiate. And also, are there Republicans in maybe swing districts, moderate Republicans, so much as they still exist in the world? Are there Republicans who are getting freaked out by this, who are like, my business community contacts are calling me in panic. They're telling me not to do this. I'm going to fold. I'm going to vote for it. How united are the parties, and how might those kind of factions play any role, or will they not play any role?
Yeah, so I think right now the Republicans are more united than the Democrats. But only a little bit. And I think that the way that Democrats are dissenting is, I think, a little different than the way you just described. So on the Republican side, they're not really getting the same pressure from the business community. And in part, I think that speaks to the administration's relationship with the business community. I think if it was...
You think Biden administration has pretty good relations then?
No, the opposite. No. I'm saying because they don't have better relations,
Because the Biden administration has pissed off the business community, so the business community will not put any pressure on the GOP.
Yeah, I mean, the business community is saying you should raise the debt limit, but they're not actually doing it. They're not really putting pressure on it. And I think this was in one of those articles recently about how quiet the business community has been. So I think that's one element of it on the Republican side. Now, again, none of the I shouldn't say none of them. Some of them are insane. But most of the Republicans don't want to default. They want, their ideal scenario is the debt limit gets raised, they get a fig leaf concession, and then they vote against it anyway. But the second choice is they get concessions and they vote for it because they want the debt limit to be raised. They don't want a default that they are going to be blamed for. On the Democratic side, I don't think there is any Democratic member of Congress who says we should be negotiating over the debt limit. Like, yes, let's have us fight about spending now and agree with the Republican position of I'm not going to vote to raise the debt limit until there is as you said, fiscal moderation. What I do think is there are Democrats who say one of two things, or both. The first is that Republicans now control the House of Congress. We have to negotiate with them sooner or later. Let's just get it over with now. And the second is I want to vote to raise the debt ceiling clean. But since there aren't the votes for that, we have to figure out what can pass and, make a deal where a deal can be made. And so I think there is dissent from the absolutely no negotiation under any circumstance sort of original stance of Democratic leadership. But I don't think there is any member of the Democratic caucus who agrees with McCarthy and says, yes, we should be doing fiscal moderation in conjunction with the debt limit and not raising the debt limit until we get that moderation. Even Democrats who agree we should be cutting spending would say we should be doing that as part of the normal budget process, not with debt limit hostage taking.
It seems to me like you could model this in game theory as like what game theorists would call a game of chicken. There's two guys driving cars straight at each other, and the one who swerves first is the chicken, and you don't want to be the one who swerves. But if neither person swerves, then you crash into each other and you die. And this is kind of like that with the Democrats saying, or at least Joe Biden saying, we will not negotiate. We just have to do it clean. And the Republicans saying, you must negotiate. We will not do it clean. And we're kind of waiting for the other person to swerve. And it sure seems to me like the Democrats are going to have to swerve, even if they say it's a negotiation that's not technically related to the debt limit. There is going to be a negotiation over something at some point. Is that kind of how you read the situation?
Yeah, I think so. But I think it's also worth, taking a step back and thinking about the real policy implications. If Democrats' concession is we negotiated and Republicans' concession is we're throwing out 98% of our stupid bill and we're just getting like the smallest fig leaf, from a Democratic perspective, it could be worse.
Yeah, well, and especially, look, a lot of the things in the Republican bill would probably be a bad idea, but some of them are good. Permitting reform is in there, not in the perfect form that I would love it, but I would love if my preferred outcome here is that we get permitting reform and a debt ceiling hike for like several years, because I am, as you know, a huge proponent of permitting reform. So that would make me very happy if that was the outcome.
I mean, look, there are parts of the Republican bill that either are related to issues. I don't know that there's any part of the Republican bill that I think like, yes, this provision is great. But there are ones that allude to things that I think are reasonable. Taking away the authority for unilateral mass debt cancellation. I think there's good reasons to be doing that. And I mean, that might even be a costless concession. If the Supreme Court is going to overturn it anyway,
You're referring to like Joe Biden's administration unilaterally saying, well, this student debt is just, we're wiping it off our books. That kind of thing. Yeah.
So one of the Republican demands, one of the big sources of their savings, their claimed savings, is by repealing the debt cancellation. And, they're claiming hundreds of billions of dollars for that. But if the Supreme Court's going to overturn it anyway, it's actually not doing anything. I think there are some, I understand that I'm not the median Democrat on this issue, but that is probably in practical terms would be a relatively costless concession, even though I understand the politics won't line up for it. There are some provisions around, rescinding COVID fund, unspent COVID funds. There isn't that much out there the way Republicans think there is, but there's you could get something there. And then, permitting reform, like you said. So I think there are things there. And then just the concept of budget caps is not crazy. Having a set amount of, saying we're going to legislate within a level we commit to, as opposed to just, doing all the spending we want and seeing what the final number is not a crazy concept. It's just the McCarthy budget caps are insanely tight and would require unreasonably deep cuts. But the philosophical concept of a discretionary budget cap, especially as you said, in these current economic times, is not crazy.
I just want to add one note that I think is fun from my perspective. In the game of chicken, game theoretically, the way that you win the game of chicken is by being credibly insane. If the other person thinks that you are not afraid to die, then they are going to have to swerve first. They are going to have to be the one that gets out of the way. And I just want to say Republicans have done a really good job of being credibly insane. Like, everyone believes, or at least a lot of people believe, they would actually just crash the ship onto the shore.
I think that's the frustrating thing for Democrats is I think that's absolutely the dynamic.
You get rewarded for being the insane guy in a negotiation because nobody wants to get into a knife fight with somebody who's insane.
Yeah.
Because you'll both get stabbed, but he might be crazier about it than you. I don't know.
Forget the knife fight analogy. Like chicken, that was already the perfect analogy. Like, you don't want to crash, and the other guy's not going to turn the car. Also, I think there's a question of, especially in Kevin McCarthy's case, even if the driver is willing to change the car, like, does the steering wheel actually work? If he tries to swerve out of the way, is the car actually going to move? It is not clear that the answer to that is yes.
I've got to think that it's yes. It's not. You're right that it's not 100%, but he has it control. And I'm damning him with faint praise. I'm saying he could definitely control like a third of his caucus, right? And so if he brings it up for a vote, he'll get like a third or some number of Republicans to vote for it that, along with Democrats, would pass it. And there's probably a bunch of 10 to 20 Democrats in the House who are going to vote against it just because they won't vote for anything that Kevin McCarthy's name is on or whatever. But I think even if he doesn't control the majority of his caucus, he controls enough of them to,
Yeah, I think
this is not great praise for him.
I think it does speak to the nature of power, especially in the Republican caucus, though, or the Republican conference, though, of you don't really get to play that card more than once, and even then, when you play that card once, you're probably done. The card being I'm going to do something that a majority of you are going to vote against, because then a majority of them can get rid of you. It's not hard to imagine. One of Kevin McCarthy's concessions for getting the speakership was giving the right-wing Republicans the ability to oust him pretty easily, and
basically a bare majority.
Yeah, and so not even that. You could have, it's like 6. If 6 Republicans vote to,
it's a very low number to call the vote, and then it's
one member to call the vote.
Yeah,
and it is if 6 Republicans vote with all the Democrats, the speakership is over. Now, do Democrats want to buoy McCarthy's speakership? No, but then also there are other Republicans who say, I would never vote, for no confidence. I'd never vote to remove you unless you being in power is dependent on a deal with Democrats. Then I would not support you. So you also sort of get this this avalanche.
And he is the weakest speaker that there's been in quite a long time, and also just ever since Boehner left, like every Republican who's led the House has been basically enthralled to the crazies, and if that's the majority of the conference, what are you going to do? I don't know.
I think this is a rewrite of history to say Boehner was not enthralled in the crazies.
Okay, fair. But by the end, I think at the beginning of his kind of leadership, not entirely, but by the end,
he was not. He was never one of them, and he never relished, giving them control. And I don't think he was so. He didn't have to be.
I don't think the crazies were as brazen then. Like, they had influence over him, but they didn't realize how far they would be able to take it in the way that they now realize exactly how much control they have. Like, they're very aware now of how much they can bully Kevin McCarthy. I don't think they were as aware back then.
And I think part of it was also, a willingness to, it sort of goes back to the game of chicken, right? Boehner was someone who was willing to say, I'm too good for this, I'm done. Like, I'm just going to throw the debt ceiling up there and then peace out. Whereas McCarthy is pretty desperate to hold on to power. And so even though Boehner was subject to the whims of the crazies, he had the ability to kind of walk away, and they knew that, and also they didn't want him to. Or enough of them didn't want him to, whereas Kevin McCarthy, really is enthralled to them and is really willing to do whatever it takes to stay there.
All right, so we're coming up on time now, and I'm going to ask the traditional final question that I always ask, which is, what should people go read or use to learn more if they're fascinated by what we've been talking about today? And as always, this could be people to follow on Twitter. This could be white papers, books, blogs, any resource that would help people who just want to learn more about everything that we've been talking about.
Sure. Well, I can't suggest people to follow on Twitter because I am no longer on Twitter.
Oh, man. Have you moved to a different service? Are you on Mastodon, or have you just kind of quit? Cold turkey.
Touching grass, man.
You're a better man than I, Ben Ritz.
But I'm now 4 months Twitter sober. It's great. And I highly recommend it for all of you who are even remotely considering it.
No, never log off, guys. Never log off.
But in terms of resources, I think the first one's Bipartisan Policy Center. They do, I think, the best independent projections of when the X date is. I'm a little biased because I used to do them for them, but I've seen how it works. It's a very good model. But we also, when I was there, did a history of the debt limit that I contributed to. And I think, and honestly, that project was actually how I learned a lot of these fun facts. And they've kept it up to date and continued updating the debt limit timeline. So I think as far as like introductory resource, I think it's a very good one. We obviously have a ton of commentary on the debt limit and possible solutions going out. So I think those are the first places I would recommend people go.
Excellent. Well, I want to say thanks for coming on the show, everyone. Ben Ritz.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening, everyone. Got thoughts, questions, comments? Send them to mailbag at cnliberalism.org, and your thought, question, or comment might be answered on the show during our next mailbag episode. Send us your thoughts, and we'll see you next time.